quickly want to give everybody a high-level overview of what SpokePhone is. SpokePhone is a feature-rich soft phone developed for Twilio. You may have heard a lead or customer ask about how do I transfer calls from Flex to my back office? Or do you have a cloud phone system for all my employees to replace my Cisco, Avaya 8x8, or any back office phone system solution? Or even, I'm installing Flex for my call center, but what are you going to do about replacing the desk phones for the rest of my business? SpokePhone provides this feature-rich soft phone to replace traditional PBX and move communications into the cloud. How does it all fit together in the Twilio ecosystem? Well, if you think about Flex as the front office tool for your contact center agents, then Spoke is the back office tool for every other employee. And together, Flex and Spoke provide end-to-end customer communication on Twilio. Flex for the front office and Spoke for the back office. SpokePhone supports voice and text channels and can be installed on Windows or Mac computers, including Android and iOS mobile devices. In today's webinar, we're going to show you how to set up your domain to automatically provision and sync users to SpokePhone. The setup also includes single sign-on. The topics we'll be covering today is what does Spoke Directory Sync provide, what directory providers SpokePhone support, configuring Spoke Directory Sync to your directory provider, and Directory Sync best practices. So what does Spoke Directory Sync provide? The SpokePhone directory feature provides IT administrators the ability to automatically provision users to Spoke as new employees join your company. We can also automatically remove users from Spoke as employees leave your company. We allow you to define rules for which employees or teams to add into Spoke. We also allow you to control user attributes synced to Spoke, like extension numbers, job titles, phone numbers, emails, and so on. So what directory providers does SpokePhone support? The SpokePhone Directory Sync feature is based on SCIM provisioning and supports most domain providers like Azure, Workday, Google Cloud, Okta, and so on. Now today, I'm going to link my Azure Active Directory to my demo environment, and I'm going to walk you through the setup and the provisioning process. So I'm currently logged into the SpokePhone Administrator console, and the setup is located on the other menu on the left, and then under Advanced. When I open my Advanced tab, I want to look for Directory Sync, and I want to select it. Now, before we can enable Directory Sync, we first need to make a few decisions of the behavior when we remove employees from, in my case, I'm going to use Azure. So the first option, what users are deleted in your, when users are deleted in your directory, what do we want to do? Do we want to suspend users in Spoke, or do we want to delete users in Spoke? This is really your decision. What we recommend is if you do have DDIs for your users, it's probably better to suspend them when you remove them from your LDAP. And then you can come and do a cleanup or a number cleanup in Spoke before deleting those users. So I'm going to leave mine as suspend. The next option, what field do you want to map for your extension number? So you may have existing extension numbers that your customers know, and when they call into your company, if they know the person's extension number, put it in during the IVR process and gets routed to that person. You need to sync those extension numbers across into SpokePhone. So the field that I normally use to sync them is just the work field, but we do have home, other, mobile, or work. I'm going to leave mine as work. And then the last one is send Spoke invite to new users. This is a very important step. because if you provision 1,000 users before going live, you may want to disable this and ensure you don't send out 1,000 email or invitation emails to the users to download the Spoke Phone app. What we normally do is we leave this off and during the setup process, which can be months in advance before that go live date, we provision the whole account. And the day of user training, we'll turn this on, send out those invitation emails, and then while we go through the training sessions, we'll take the users through the step-by-step process to get that installed. For now, I'm just going to leave this off. Great, so I'm ready. I'm going to click the next button. And I use Azure, so I'm going to select Azure 80 and then get started. So when you get started with your setup, we provide you with a step-by-step process that you can follow to easily set up your provisioning. Step one, basically we need to create an enterprise application in Azure that we're going to link our users to. We're just going to go through that setup to get that done. So I'm going to pivot to my Azure. And firstly, I'm just going to go to my enterprise applications section. I'm going to click on new application. I'm going to click on create your own application, and I'm going to give my application a name. So I'm going to say webinar user sync. I'm going to click on create. Now, while this is being created, I do want to pivot. I'm just going to open manage users in a new tab, and I just want to see what users we currently have. So we have 4 users and 1 active. And I should be able to edit these because these weren't synced through my LDAP. So I'm going to leave that open in a tab while we go through the setup process. Great. So our enterprise application in Azure is now created. Let's move on to the next step. So the next step is to configure our Csm admin credentials and then set up our provisioning. So I'm going to pivot back to Azure, and I am going to look for provision user accounts, and I'm going to click on get started. Okay, so first option, provisioning mode, we definitely want this to be automatic. And now we get to the tenant URL and secret token. So if we go back to our steps, that's going to be at the bottom. So this is our URL. We're going to copy that and paste. And we're also going to do the same with our token and paste. Now let's test that connection. Okay, the connection tested successfully, and we are going to move on to the save button. Great. So now we've got additional settings, mappings and settings. Let's pivot back to our guide and continue to the next step. So it says ensure both groups and users are enabled. Okay. And then also make sure that the group and user mappings are selected. So create, update, delete, enabled, yep. And then also make sure object ID is mapped to external ID. Okay, great. So going back to Azure, I'm firstly going to expand mappings. So groups and users both enabled. And then let's go to users. Okay, enabled, yes. Create, update, delete, selected. And now external ID needs to be mapped to object ID. Oh, mine is mapped to mail nickname. So I'm going to actually change this field and select object ID and say OK. Confirm object ID, external ID. Perfect. And we're going to go save. Okay. Now also just want to double check what's under the settings. Yeah, I don't need to send any notifications. And I think that's done for the settings. Okay, let's pivot back to our guide and move on to the next step. So the next step is to assign users or groups into our new enterprise application to be synced. So we're going to follow users and groups on the left menu. We're going to add a few users, and then we're going to assign and start provisioning. Okay, perfect. So we're going to go users and groups. Now, when you set up provisioning for the first time, just add 1 or 2 users and make sure everything is synced and it's working correctly as like a test group. I'm going to say add user, users. Now I've got 2 users that I can use as a test. I've got a CSM user that I'm going to select. And also I've got a customer success user that I'm going to select. So I'm going to be syncing 2 users today. Let's say assign. These are 2 users. Now the last step is to start the provision. So it wants us to follow the provisioning menu, change the scope to sync only assigned users and groups, and then start provisioning. Okay, so we're going to go provisioning on the left. We're going to click the start button. And provisioning started. Great, so now we're just going to give it a few seconds to get those 2 users synced. So let's go to our guide. Just make sure this is all done. That's perfect. We can close that out. And now in the Spokephone admin console, we're going to click the refresh button. Great, and now we can see 2 additional users sync at the bottom. However, the first name and last name, test users and webinars test, we should go and change that in just a second. Right, so let's look at this webinar test user. As a Spokephone administration or administrator, if I click edit, I won't be able to edit these user accounts because these user accounts is managed through my domain. So we're going to give you a message saying this profile is managed via your company's employee directory platform. This means I can't change. The only thing I can maybe do is change the rights, but I can't change anything except map the IDs to this user account. The extension number 1162 probably synced from Azure. So what I want to do is I want to change a few things. First name and last name. And I'm going to go back to Azure, but I'm going to exit out of my enterprise application. I'm going to leave the provisioning started. And I'm going to just pivot to my normal domain users and groups. So firstly, I'm going to edit the CSM user. I'm going to say edit properties. Right, so this is our test user. So let's give this user a name. And we're going to say Joan Pope, just as an example. Also, I want to see what extension number is assigned. So business phone, which is our work field, 2001. I'm going to save. Now, one thing you should note is on the automatic provisioning, it depends on your Azure settings. My Azure is set to automatically sync at an interval of 20 minutes. So any changes I make to synced accounts will only reflect after every 20 minutes within Spokephone. However, there is a provision on demand button if you change something and you need it to take effect immediately. So let me go back into my enterprise application. Go back to our user sync. And then I'm going to go back to provisioning. And I'm going to use the provision on demand button to sync those changes we just put in. So provision on demand. The user was CSM. We're going to say provision. It's going to say validating. This is going to take just a few seconds. But when I provision on demand, the system will tell me exactly what changes was made, if any. Okay, so provisioning complete, and it's telling me the name test was changed to Joan. The last name user was changed to Pope. So let's go back to our Spoke admin side. And we go back to manage users. And now we can see Joan Pope extension 2001. So let's delete this user and I'll show you the suspend feature. Webinar test. So we're going to go back to Azure. We're going to go back to our enterprise applications. We're going to go to users and groups, but we're going to delete this user from our sync. So we're going to say remove. Now we only have the one user left. However, I don't want to wait 20 minutes for this change to take effect. So again, I'm going to go to provisioning, provision on demand. Look for my user, say provision. And we can see the change active was changed to false. So if we go back to our users, if we just refresh our page, you can see this user is grayed out and we have a line through the active block. So if we go into this account, you'll see this account is now suspended. So now this is going to give me an opportunity to reassign phone numbers that may have been linked to this user and just clean up this account. So on the other end, if I go back to my other left menu and I go back to advanced, the same goes for single sign-on. We just create a single sign-on enterprise application and we link our users to that application and upload the XML into the single sign-on section. So I want to take you through a few best practices when it comes to syncing. So as you saw, I just tested 2 users. We recommend when you set up your provisioning to only sync a handful of users as a test before adding your whole directory or domain. During this results, you may find that your extension number isn't syncing. Maybe your mappings isn't set up correctly. Maybe your user suspension isn't working when you remove users. So we always recommend testing a few users, making sure all the aspects and attributes for those accounts are being synced correctly before you upload your whole domain. Now, as you saw the banner, if you sync a user into SpokePhone, that profile will not be, or that user account will not be editable within the Spoke admin console. All data changes on that account will come from your domain. And just keep in mind that any changes after your initial sync can take up to 20 minutes. I've seen someone's Azure sync interval set to 40 minutes. And if you don't want to wait for that time, you can either change your settings in Azure to reduce your syncing interval, or you can use the provision on demand button to make changes take effect immediately. Now, the extension, I'm going to pivot back to my admin console quickly. I'm going to go back into directory sync. These settings you set up in the beginning is very important because the extension field, whatever you map here, is going to stick as the mapping. So I map work, and work is equals to business phone in Azure. So if I go back to my provisioning, I go back to my enterprise application. If I need to change my mappings and provisioning is already started, it is possible. I can come to provisioning. I can say edit attribute mappings. I can go into my user mappings. And I could say my extension I may want to map that to a different field. So I can either add a new mapping or change mappings. Every time I do something, I do need to provision again. But this field you select is very important. So you can see, based on my example, sometimes the office phone, which is the business phone, which equals to the work field, is selected. Other times, folks have the others or the phone others selected, or the phone mobile, or the phone local. So that mapping is important to make sure your extensions is being synced across. Okay, well, I want to open up the floor for questions, and Chan, hand it back to you.
Thanks, Leon. So we have a few questions here. We got a couple questions from Jonas. The first one is, why suspend instead of deleting an account when it's deleted from the AD?
Gotcha, that's a great question. I'm going to pivot back to admin. So Jonas, when I set up users in SpokePhone, I may give them the IDs, right? So if I go to my phone numbers, and this is probably pretty common for PBX users to have phone numbers. But if I get a number, you can see this is currently assigned to Spoke Attendant IVR. However, you can assign user numbers directly to specific users. And then from a user perspective, I may have 2, 3, 4 DID numbers. If I delete this user account without remapping those DID numbers, I may end up losing my numbers. And maybe I didn't want that. That's why we suspend, giving you the opportunity to change DIDs before deleting. Now, this is your choice. You can set your Azure to delete, right? I prefer suspend because I know I'm going to have at least 3 or 4 DIDs mapped to a user account.
Okay, thanks. I'll move on to the next question. Have you seen difficulties depending on the AD provider? Some are better integrated than others.
Yeah, definitely. I do see Azure being the most commonly used AD or LDAP provider. Google is pretty easy. We've got numerous setups both between Azure and Google. I haven't done a Workday setup yet, but I do think Azure is probably the most commonly used one out there.
Okay, thanks. Another one. Flex requires SAML 2.0. Do you know if it's compatible with Spoke as well? You mentioned another protocol.
Spoke SSO is SAML 2.0, exactly the same as Flex.
Okay. And then this last question from Anton. Is there a logging system in SpokePhone or Azure directory about who and when they have been deprovisioned? How do we follow the active license of the month for billing purpose? Thank you.
Gotcha. So Azure provides its own logging system, normal out-of-the-box reports, and you can report on any group or users sync. Most companies, Antoine, will actually sync a group and not users like I did today, and then they just report on that group. And whatever's in the group, that is going to be your licenses. However, if you pivot to Spoke, you click Manage Users, you see active. If active is checked, means they're using the app. If it's not checked, then they haven't gone through the setup process yet, and that won't count as active. So you track it with the active field.
Great. Those are some great questions. Thank you for submitting them. However, if you do have more questions, please feel free to reach out to one of us, myself or Leon. Leon and I will include our contact information in the follow-up email. But thank you so much for taking your time for joining today. We hope to see you on our next session, and have a very good day, everybody. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Thank you.